Welcome to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast where we explore all things theology and therapy. I'm your host, Grace Brown, registered psychotherapist with Journey with Grace Counseling Services, also certified Canadian counselor.
And I'm Brad Watson, author and pastor of Nexus Church. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa. Good morning, Grace. We are back with another episode of The Sacred Sofa. Good to see you again.
You too, Brad. Hello, and hello, listeners. As we explore more on The Sacred Sofa, we're going to be talking about sex on a ladder. Brad, set the tone for us, will you?
Yes, indeed. This is always a juicy one, so this should be fun, Grace. But yeah, we've been talking the past few weeks about marriage and relationships, but I thought let's talk specifically about sex. And I thought I would introduce the sort of theme of today by referencing a book I picked up a few years ago. Absolutely fascinating book. It's called A Billion Wicked Thoughts. And the whole book is essentially an exploration of human sexuality through two major data breaches that happened in the early 2000s. One by a spy website, one by AOL, released a whole bunch of people's search history. And, you know, it was messy and definitely not a good thing, but for sex researchers, it was a treasure trove of information. But I thought I would start with a line from the book that I think just captures what a unique time we are in. They say this: "It is hard to imagine a more revolutionary development in the history of human sexuality than the internet. For instance, with a visit to an adult video site, you can see more naked bodies in a single minute than the most promiscuous Victorian would have seen in an entire lifetime." My goodness, that line just, yeah, right? I mean, it's just, wow, when you think about it, we really are living in a unique time when it comes to sexuality. Reliable contraception alone changed the game, and that's been around, 50, 60 years, like reliable contraception. And then in the past 20 years, with the advent of the internet, the sexual landscape, I think, has changed forever for people. So I thought I would start with a softball question here, Grace, about internet pornography, because that's an easy one. But
Softball, you say?
I'm not sure, Grace, if this is an area at all that you've dealt with clients of yours. But could you maybe talk to us a bit about how pornography affects relationships, how that works within relationships? Is this something you've encountered?
Yes, it is a topic that comes up in relationship counseling. Interestingly enough, the most common challenge begins with the lack of communication about it. Folks tend to assume that their partner or partners are not using it, or they assume that they are using it, but then they have their own assumptions about their partner's use of it. So then there's this tension because one party finds out or discovers the frequency or the type of porn, and that can become a challenge for folks. And like sex, it can be an uncomfortable topic for people to discuss. It just is. The women specifically that I work with sometimes are confused on how they should feel or respond to their partner's use of porn. It's this don't ask, don't tell mentality, which actually isn't helpful. It doesn't work in these cases. And so the work that I do with clients can support them in asking their own personal reflection questions about their beliefs, thoughts, and values and opinions regarding porn, and then asking them to ask questions of each other with a curiosity lens rather than a critical lens. And they can work together to identify what the values and expectations they are going to be regarding their sex life together.
Interesting. Now, in follow-up question for you here, Grace, in my own reading on this a bit, I have heard, different studies have been done that if a couple uses pornography together, the findings on how that stresses the relationship or not are, inconclusive. But one of the big issues, and you've already alluded to it, is that for men in particular, it tends to be a solo experience. It's something, like you said, they kind of, tends to happen, a don't ask, don't tell. I'm just curious, what is it about porn, do you think, that makes it hard for couples to talk about? Is it just one of those taboo things, or somebody thinks they're doing something wrong, so they're hiding it? Like, any ideas around that?
I think that's largely it. It's a taboo topic. And
Mm.
so, when you talk about the introduction of the internet, before there was magazines, and even that had, some sort of screening, if you're going into
Yes.
store with the magazines, or video stores, and it's always in the back, hidden. Like,
Yeah.
what we say about sex and pornography can say something, but it's also what we don't say that can also be speaking. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so the subject is very taboo. I would say
Mm.
it's been largely till most recently more of a men's industry. So
Hmm.
a product, designed and marketed for men, and that too is changing. And so men are over there doing whatever it is they do over there. Don't ask,
Mm.
don't tell. But because it becomes so much more mainstream and so much more encouraged in some people, in some couples' experience, but it hasn't translated to talking more. It's just
Mm.
assumed. And
Right.
we can't assume expectations, beliefs. We have to be able to, with gentleness, compassion, and curiosity, start to talk about it.
Mm. Hmm. Absolutely.
So, what about you, Brad? Is there a way to think about this theologically?
Well, that's a good question because I do think, Grace, that this is one of the big questions of our time. And I mean, uh, I like to sort of joke to whoever listened that when I was growing up, my parents would talk about how they had to get to school, walk uphill both ways through 3 feet of snow. It was this
Right,
big
right.
deal. And I think for this generation behind us, the joke might be, hey, in our day, we had to work to get porn. Like it was a
Mm-hmm,
task. Like you
mm-hmm,
said, it's in the back of the store. It was kind of, to access porn, it was a lot of work, or you had to be willing to cross some lines. But today it's prevalent, it's everywhere.
mm-hmm.
And so, particularly with men, I'll say this, I just sort of assume men are dabbling in pornography to one extent or the other. I think that's just a safer assumption than going, what, really? You've looked up porn? I just
Mhm.
assume it's
To your
happening.
point, when I'm working with couples who are sort of going back into or entering the dating stream, it is actually one of the guideline questions in terms
Mm.
of questions around sex and sexuality. It's like, the question no longer is, are you doing porn? The question is, how often? You're going to now ask
Right.
about frequency and type and things like that because it's so mainstream now.
It's so mainstream. It's so easy to access. It's just there. And so I always want to in this discussion, for me growing up, it was anything like that is wrong. With the
Hmm.
prevalence of it though, I just always want to be really gentle and compassionate. I mean, it's
Hmm.
everywhere. I assume people are looking at it. And I've done a whole teaching on this, Grace. Maybe this is something we should explore a little bit more in depth later on. But let me give you I hate to say any specific this is right, this is wrong. Well, I'll just speak from my own experience.
Hmm.
And I would say I boiled down, there's 6 things that concern me about porn. So I'll just go through those quickly. The first is this: I'm concerned about my own conscience, right? I sort of glibly like to say, rarely in a day do you go, my goodness, I felt good about my day. I've worked out, I've eaten well, and I looked at some porn. Like that's
Mhm,
just
mhm,
not usually one of the things you put in your, hey, this is a great day kind of thing.
mhm,
And I understand that there are some of us are carrying baggage and shame and guilt. So maybe that's playing into our conscience, but I never want to ignore my own conscience. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I am concerned about justice and exploitation.
mhm,
Ellie Hamalian, she's an abolitionist working for the eradication of modern slavery. And she says, as a modern abolitionist, she's seen that human sex trafficking is linked time and time again to prostitution, which is linked oftentimes to pornography. So it's just
mhm,
a dicey area. So that's the second thing.
mhm,
Third, and I highly recommend this podcast, the Butterfly Effect by John Ronson. He does a whole deep dive on the porn industry. It's absolutely fascinating. And he's a great writer as well. But one of the things he brought up has me concerned about men and young men in particular. And one of the things he highlighted in his podcast was this: he says there's been a 1,000% increase in erectile dysfunction between 18 and 24-year-old men. And it coincides with the explosion of availability of free online porn. For him, he said it makes one think that maybe the two things are
Hmm.
interconnected. So
Interesting.
that's
Interesting.
and for in terms of the availability of it, again, I say it jokingly, but it was hard to access porn. With how easy it is today, I think
Hmm.
for especially young people who don't have a memory before the internet, it could be very easy to become this is the easiest way to get in, explore your sexuality.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
and it might be addictive that way. The fourth thing I would say, I'm concerned about my own head. I don't want to objectify women. I don't want that in my head. I don't want that to be part of my own
Hmm.
experience interacting with people. So that's a concern. Fifth, I'm concerned about the impact it has on women. And the Atlantic, a great journal, recently had a article called "The Startling Rise of Choking During Sex." And one of the things that really stood out to me is they said a full 25% of women in the US have reported feeling scared during sex.
Hmm.
And I find that just disturbing that that might be someone's experience. And of course, they link it to choking a partner has become something in porn world that's kind of normalized. And if you don't see porn as like a fiction, a fantasy thing, and expect that to be a normal thing, it can create a boundary.
Hmm. Hmm.
And the sixth final thing, Gail Dines, professor of sociology at Wheelock College. She's the author of Pornland, How Porn Has Hijacked Our Society. In terms of the science, she says this: the thing is, no matter what you think of pornography, whether it's harmful or harmless fantasy, the science is there. After 40 years of peer-reviewed research, scholars can say with confidence that porn is an industrial product that shapes how we think about gender, sexuality, relationships, intimacy, sexual violence, and gender equality for the worse. And so,
Hmm.
an interesting book to at least take into account and have that as part of the conversation. So, all in all, I would say this, Grace: I have reservations and
Hmm.
concerns about
Hmm.
pornography, and yet I'd almost maybe compare it this way, Grace. I have great concerns about gas powered cars, right? Like maybe we should be cutting our fossil fuel, but it's everywhere and it's prevalent. So, how do we
Hmm.
navigate this world? But that's just one part. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, that's okay. Like, there's a lot to think about here. I think there's a lot to impact, and this may be a bonus episode in the future because I think there's a lot here, and we don't want to necessarily gloss over it. But
Mhm.
one of the things I'm thinking about here, whether it's gas powered cars or climate change and the things that are important to the world, none of these things are neutral,
Mm,
and how much more important in terms of our sex and sexuality, our mental health, our spiritual health. These things aren't neutral. And I think we do a
mm,
great disservice to ourselves, our relationships, if we don't actually think and reflect on a deeper level about a lot of these things. And
mhm.
so I appreciate, your summary of your six main concerns. And I think it would be a great opportunity to explore a bit more. You're speaking often from a lens from the male's perspective. And I
Yes.
think it would be time for me to do a bit more exploration in terms of research about women. I'm wondering if there's starting to become more research about the impact it's had on women.
Yeah, and I think that would be a great place to explore. And again, I don't want to create any sort of shame around porn, but it's one of those things that I think we need to talk about and
Hmm.
an informed discussion, right? Not just, hey, it's bad, hey, it's good. Well, let's deal with what's out there. So, yes, maybe
Hmm.
a future episode there, Grace. But we could get into the whole online world. That is just one facet of the sex discussion. But why don't we move along and let's talk about how we understand sex and sexual ethics through our socialization. Can you help me, Grace, maybe talk about how you help your clients think about that? Whether our ideas are inherited, whether our ideas about sex are inherited from our maybe our family of origin or how we absorb messages about sex culturally, I think that needs to be a part of the discussion. So, how do you help clients think about their lens for viewing sex?
Hmm. And sex and sexuality, of course, is an important topic. God has given us our sex and sexuality. And well, again, we do ourselves a disservice to not have open, healthy, and vulnerable conversations about this topic. When I work with clients in session, I work with them to explore their own beliefs, values, and opinions, and then explore where have you received these messages, remembering
Mm,
that socialization is the process of learning how to operate in society. And we're getting so many influences, whether it's through parents, extended family, media. These are all inroads to how we see the world and ourselves in the world. And so, where have they received the messages around sex and sexuality? What's the meaning they've made about the messages, not only about the topic, but their own sense of self in the sexual context?
mm,
Sometimes, again, the influence of socialization is what is being said, but also what is not being said.
ah,
When parents don't discuss sex and sexuality with their children, they're sending a message. They're
mhm,
sending a message. You know, in my home of origin, we didn't talk about it.
mm.
I still remember my dad bringing home the big fat book. It looked big to me at that age, put it on the dining room table. It was called, I think it was called The Joy of Sex. And he was like, read it. And we're all just like, and I remember sneaking over when no one was looking and I'm like rifling through the pages, just to see what's in there and then seeing some pictures, like little cartoon drawings. And I'm just like, but I never actually read it because my parents didn't want to talk about it. Siblings
Mm,
didn't want to talk about it. And so it started to create this mystery and uncomfortableness about the topic. And so
mm,
what parents are saying and even not saying sends a message. And unfortunately, farming out that responsibility to others is just not helpful. Whether it
mm,
be a church or a school, the children and families need to be talking about it as a unit. And the reality is, society has an agenda, and it's not only for the benefit of us, it's not always for our benefit. Marketers know our psyche incredibly well, and they will use anything to sell their product,
mm,
even if it requires some oppressional measures. I
mm.
give you an example. A few years ago, I was in a store that sold alcohol, and as I was catching out, I heard the clerk say, "Would you like a sticker?" And this small voice, turns out it was a child around 5 or so, says, "Yes." Check that out. That child will remember that positive experience. Their
Mm,
view of this setting will remain in their mind. How their parents and others discuss or don't discuss alcohol is going to
uh,
influence how this child grows up to use or not use alcohol. And you can be sure the marketers were intentional about having those stickers available. How many
huh.
adults are going to be looking for a sticker? And so marketers are counting on future customers, even at that
Mm,
small age. And so, then the same with sex and sexuality, pop up ads throughout social media are luring us like digital siren songs. And so,
mm.
we just got to become more aware of what's going on around us.
Yeah, you know what? That's a healthy reminder to me because yeah, my kids are at the age where they occasionally watch reels with me on Instagram, and sometimes some questionable stuff can pop up there, and all these things are getting stuck in our minds. And that idea of creating future customers is fascinating to me by creating an early positive experience and the
Mhm.
opportunity that gives parents or caregivers that if we can provide our kids a healthy introduction to sex rather than them figuring it out at school or wherever the first messages are, I think that's
Mhm.
incredibly important. I'd love to know how, if you have any recommendations for parents around what are some great ways to start talking about sex with your kids. And kind of throw you
Mhm.
uh
Mhm.
one right there.
As early as appropriately possible. It's starting
Mm.
with proper identification of body parts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
No pseudo names. What we're learning more in terms of research and risk of abuse is the lack of knowledge. And so
Interesting.
children knowing what belongs to them, knowing healthy boundaries around saying no, so getting help and assistance from a safe adult, like opening up that conversation actually creates more safety rather than closing the conversation down or not introducing it at all. And
Hmm.
so, children are curious. They are naturally curious. And
Yep.
so, identifying healthy use of language around sex is really important. And then take it up, in with more information as the child grows, right? In
Hmm.
an age appropriate way.
Hmm. That's a great idea. I love the idea that no knowledge is what creates hazardous conditions, really. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
that seems very important.
So I'd like to curve towards the theological again, Brad.
Hmm.
When it comes to church community, how do you help people think through socialization around this topic, sex, sexuality, and porn?
Yeah, I'm starting to realize more and more that different generations were exposed to different things. So, I grew up in the late 80s, 90s, and so that might be a very different time than if you grew up in the 60s or 70s. For my generation, those of us who came of age, you could say the late 80s, 90s, early 2000s,
Hmm.
just out of my own experience, I would say there's a couple of things to think about. So, there was a certain culture of licentiousness, maybe not so, to the extent of the late 60s necessarily, but I
Hmm.
think of a movie. This was actually pretty formative in my time. American Pie came out in 1999. This was the rage for a while. This was, if you go back and watch it now, it is, as my kids would say, cringe, like just so cringy things that we would never put up with today.
Hmm.
But the idea of the film was the most important thing is to just have sex by the time you graduate. Just go out there,
Hmm.
lie, manipulate, whatever you have to do to have sex, go and do it by any means possible. And this was a bit of a celebration of this at the time, right? A lot
Hmm.
has changed in the past 20 years, thank goodness.
Hmm.
But that was definitely out there. And I think we need to recognize that. For people, though, who grew up in the church, there was a totally different thing happening. I think as a response to maybe some of that licentiousness, there was a
Hmm.
purity culture, which is perhaps, I think, best personified by the book I Kissed Dating Goodbye, Joshua McDowell. That came out in 1997. So you've got these two competing narratives in the late
Hmm.
90s there.
Hmm.
But the damage purity culture did is just the more I talked to couples over my pastoral ministry, it
Hmm.
did a lot of damage and left people with a lot of unhealthy ideas. And I would say three things, particularly for me, for those of us who grew up in that purity culture time.
Hmm.
He created, and you've already alluded to this, a fascination with the forbidden. That would be the first thing. Like you said, kids, teens were naturally curious. And if you don't get good information, if you're just told sex, wrong, don't do it, it makes you more curious than ever. I
Hmm.
really
Hmm.
think the Genesis 3 story, Adam and Eve in the garden, it's so indicative of human nature. If you are told don't do something, boy, does it make you want to do it.
Hmm.
And so I think that's swirling in our minds, that constant fascination with the forbidden. The second thing I would say purity culture did is it gave us this equation that marriage equals wholeness or fulfillment.
Hmm.
And what happens is then you have all these people coming of age, getting married, 1 month in, the night of the marriage, whatever it is, very early figuring out, whoa, this isn't
Hmm.
making me whole, completing me. I've been sold a bill of good about marriage. This is hard. Sex is hard right now. So that's going on. And then I think the most prevalent one is sex is dirty or shameful. And
Hmm.
that
Hmm.
was, a thing that so many people, both men and women, I would say, are
Hmm.
dealing with when they grew up with that as part of their culture. But I got to ask you, Grace, because I'll be honest, I wasn't as socialized in purity culture as many others I know. I was outside of the church kind of at that point, never took that part real seriously. I'm
Hmm.
curious what your experience was, and what would you say, maybe from a therapeutic perspective, to those today who are, they have some baggage from purity culture.
Hmm. Hmm. Well, I was definitely raised in purity culture.
Mm,
I grew up in a church setting as well, a very ultra conservative church setting. And so in my household, lack of information, even in terms of basic biology, sex ed was sort of just coming into being a thing as part of curriculum. And I was pulled from that class. And
Okay.
so, the materials I received, thankfully, were handouts from a teacher that I read. So I was completely ignorant of what was happening, not only with my own body, but in terms of sex. And
Mm,
so, raised in that purity culture, and I've used the protected space of therapy for myself to unpack some of the baggage and harm that I had been impacted with. And so, I'm passionate about this too, healthy relationships of all kinds. My lived experience can at times guide some of the reflection questions in our work together.
mm,
And we've talked briefly in a previous episode about the harms of patriarchy and misogyny, which has completely infiltrated the many churches. And those rigid beliefs absolutely influences one's sense of self. There's where that shame piece comes in, that
mm,
guilt piece comes in, and it includes their view of sex and sexuality. Inequality naturally is going to show up in one's sex life. And
mm.
so there's a lot of unpacking in the therapeutic space for folks who have baggage from purity culture or harmful messages of socialization.
Mm. Wow, and you kind of described there like a a big double storm because you've got parents who don't want to talk about sex,
Hmm.
and then the one avenue available to you, a school curriculum, they forbid you from that as well. So that really puts you in a vacuum, right? If your parents aren't talking about it, can't hear what's being said at school, that leaves in many ways either the playground or
Hmm.
where else are you going to get your ideas
Hmm.
about sex?
Let me tell you, I was very happy for that literature because I don't even want to know where I would have found out more information.
Mm,
And so, which is why I'm so passionate about parents and caregivers being taking their responsibility to provide safe, healthy information for those that they are in charge of.
mm,
I'm gonna go back to you, Brad. The church in the 90s, and I would say long before, seemed
mm,
to make sex this dirty, shameful thing. Where does that come from, you think? Is there
mm.
actual stigmatization of sex in scripture?
But it's interesting because there is, of course, we've talked in a previous episode that singleness was celebrated in the early church, but that disappeared pretty quick when people figured out, oh, I guess Jesus isn't coming back tomorrow, right? And it's interesting to me because Jesus and the New Testament writers, they definitely talk about sexual ethics, but it's very brief, like, hey, don't lust, you know, don't no sexual immorality, although what that meant is a bit of a mystery to us, right? They're in a
Mhm.
very distinct culture. So Jesus and the New Testament writers, actually what they say about the act of sex itself is pretty infrequent. Like there's not a whole lot there. But what makes this all the more bizarre to me, Grace, is that the Bible has an entire book dedicated to very erotic poetry.
Mm,
Song of Songs in the Old Testament, part of the wisdom literature there, it is a celebration, a very explicit celebration of human sexuality. And
mhm,
uh, talking about cringe, like it's hard to read the book with a straight face because it is just, it lays it on pretty thick. But one of the interesting things I found is that the female voice in the book of Song of Songs is very profound. And this is pre New Testament, right? It gives us one of the very first credos you could say to love. At the end of the book, the female voice of the book launches into this incredible poem about how powerful love is.
mhm,
And I was interested to realize we wouldn't have heard this in the church in the 80s and 90s, but in second wave feminism, this book began to be quite celebrated as one of the earliest forms of literature where women actually have agency. Old
mhm,
Testament, of course, all across the world, patriarchy reigning. That's just the norm. So in this book, we have a woman with complete agency. She's very erotic. She's very sexual. And it's a celebration of all of that.
mhm.
So it's so bizarre to me that a whole book dedicated to that we would come to stigmatize and shame it. Very
Interesting.
bizarre. But I think if we take that book as a bit of a go-to, what we find there is that sex is celebrated and that sex involves all of us. It involves our bodies, but it also involves our soul, our emotions. So for me, when I think about sexual ethics, I do start there. And that's just my personal sexual ethic, but I start with the idea that sex involves the whole person.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I'm curious, in dealing with clients, how do you help individuals and couples realize, because I'm sure it's a source of conflict a lot of times, that maybe sex and, conflict about that, it's more than just the physical act? Or I don't know, maybe do you think it's possible in relationships for sex to remain, purely physical?
Hmm. Hmm. Well, frankly, I've yet to work with any individuals or partners who appear to think that sex is just physical.
Right.
The people I support have experienced varying forms of sexual betrayal. It's a betrayal because there are expectations for the boundaries around their sexual practices and consent. And so, from physical sexual infidelity to digital forms of sexual betrayal. Okay. You may be interested to know that part of this work is guiding couples to verbalize clear boundaries
Mm.
around how their expectations are, their work, their practice around their own social media usage and content. You know,
Hmm.
that's one of the newer areas of boundary violations that I've actually started to work with couples. There's this chasm of discussion about expectations around social media.
Interesting.
And it's interesting because, folks will have expectations and you'll start to hear what their beliefs and expectations are because of the conflict,
Uh,
right? So, friending people who were ex-partners, for example. Like, it's fascinating that
hmm
these things don't come up ahead of time.
Right.
There's a resource that also use with clients, especially those entering or re-entering the dating world, and it's a book by Dr. John Van Epp, and it's called How to Avoid Falling in Love with a Jerk.
Sounds
Okay?
like a good premise.
It's a really good premise. Socialization would have us believe that jumping into bed will solidify a relationship, but
Hmm.
that doesn't work for most people. And Van Epp uses this model called the RAM model, which stands for Relationship Attachment Model. And the model includes 5 areas on a spectrum. So he visualizes it like, a sound system. And so you've got the equalization board that moves from top to high.
Hmm.
And in the categories on that spectrum, it's how much do you know someone, trust, rely, commit, and touch in that order. And in
Hmm.
short, the level of what you know about someone will determine the level of trust that you have, how much you can rely on them, how much you want to commit or continue to commit with them. And this absolutely influences your feeling of safety and the level of physical intimacy.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
often the message of the society is backwards, right? And
Yes.
so most folks I work with believe that sex is special and at least have encountered someone who also believes it to be true.
Hmm. Oh, you're talking. Yeah. Oh, that's good stuff right there. That we'll have to post up that book. That sounds like a great resource for people.
Hmm. Hmm.
Hmm.
So you think that sex involves a whole person? I would tend to agree.
Hmm.
How do you believe we should see sexual ethics?
Well, you're already hitting on something there. That sounds like a great resource, because I'd be like, wow, that's good stuff. So for me, growing up, there was rights and wrongs. I prefer to see sexual ethic as almost a wisdom thing. And so my sexual ethic would have at least 3 elements. It would be character, vulnerability, and pleasure. So I'll just talk very quickly as we wrap up here about each of them. Character. We know our character by how we treat people that we
Hmm.
pass on the street, how we treat our friends, family. So we understand how character works. So often, though, I think we divorce that from the sexual experience.
Ah,
So
yes.
what I do in the bedroom has nothing to do with who I am the rest of the time. And I would say that's ridiculous. Who we are sexually, how we play out our sexuality says
Hmm.
something about our character. And if you're a jerk in bed, if you take advantage of people, like all of that says something about us.
I would agree. Who we are outside of sex will show up in sex. Agreed.
Absolutely. It's both ways, right? Absolutely. So, yes, that would be where I would start. The second is vulnerability. And you really picked it up on there on that book. I would say to have sex with someone is really to witness them at their most vulnerable, right? Like to
Hmm.
see someone naked and to be involved with them naked, it changes things. It really does.
Hmm.
And so to be vulnerable is to give yourself to another person as a whole person. It's the complete, I would also say, antidote to for power and control is to take vulnerability into the equation. And so I'm forgetting her name. I'll post it up later off the top of my head. But someone says any exercise of sexuality that violates appropriate vulnerability is wrong. And so I like that idea. And I think jumping on what you just said too, there's a principle of proportionality. And so I would say the level of sexual encounter has to be on par with the level of maturity of the relationship, the commitment, the vulnerability, the trust, all that stuff there. And I totally agree with you. So often we try to do it backwards. Jump the gun sexually and it will create trust, vulnerability, all that stuff. I go, no, 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 no. It's the other way around. We need to know a person, trust them, be able to be vulnerable with them. And then sexuality becomes an expression, an outworking of that. That I think helped keep us safe, helps protect us against harm, maybe. I wouldn't want to put hard rules around anything. But those three things, character, vulnerability, and then pleasure, of course, but we can get to that another time. Those things I think are really important as we think about sexual ethics.
Absolutely. And we want to say mutual pleasure. Again, the antidote of power, misuse of power and control. We want to, like, all parties involved. And that you talk about a thin place moment. And I would love for us to explore a bit more about that as well.
Yes. Well, hopefully another time, but I do think sex is a glimpse into the divine. That's my theological bent coming out there, and absolutely mutual pleasure. I think that discussion has to be front and center, making sure this is pleasurable, not for one, but for both parties. So those three things.
And moving that up the ladder, can you sort of help us visualize that?
Yeah, absolutely. As you realize who you are, your character, you go, hey, I want to be a loving person, a giving person, kind person. That has to show up in the bedroom. If that's part of my character, I want to be, known as selfless, as giving, that has to show up in the bedroom. Vulnerability, if I'm willing to get naked with someone physically, I better be willing to go there with them emotionally as well. And then again, yes, mutual pleasure.
And that's gonna lend to the mutual pleasure. Right?
Absolutely.
Both parties showing up in that same way with that same intention can only end in that beautiful thin place moment.
I believe so.
This has been fantastic. Sex on a ladder, moving up higher, always with the goal of leveling up. So very important. Absolutely. Well, Brad, it's been another incredible episode. Lots to unpack and reflect on. This has been fantastic.
Yes, we'll see you next time, Grace.
See you next time.